Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar titled Science for the Public Good, Who is Benefiting? Thank you for joining us online. My name is Kirsten Matthews. I'm the Fellow for Science and Technology Policy at the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University. I'm also the Director for the Science and Technology Policy Program and the Biomedical Research Program at the Baker Institute. Today's event is a collaboration between Baker Institute and Wake Forest University's Center for Bioethics, Health, and Society. Before we start, I would like to thank our sponsors for today's events, including Rice University's Brown School of Engineering, Weiss School of Natural Sciences, the Chang family, the Kavli Foundation, and the Natural Science Foundation, who have sponsored our webinar series over this past year on a range of science policy topics, including science research funding, innovation policies, vaccines, international collaboration, and effective science communication. All past events can be viewed on our Baker Institute YouTube website if you're interested. Finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank my collaborator at Wake Forest, Professor Ana Iltis, who will be moderating today's discussion. Dr. Iltis is a professor of philosophy and the director of the Center for Bioethics, Health, and Society at Wake Forest University. She is also the president of the American Society of Bioethics and Humanities, a society which represents approximately 2,000 professionals in this field. She is also a Rice alum with a PhD from our philosophy department, so we're proud to have her. In addition, she is a non-resident scholar at the Baker Institute and a longtime collaborator for the Center of Health and Biosciences. Her research covers ethics and policies associated with stem cells, human embryo research, and public and stakeholder engagement in the development of science policy. Welcome, Dr. Iltis.
Thank you, Dr. Matthews. It is a great pleasure and privilege to have with us today two fantastic speakers whose work has shaped our understanding and appreciation of the relationship between society and science. Significant advances in science and technology capture our attention, and we're often awed by the promise they hold. Those advances generally reflect prior policy decisions about what kind of research to support or fund. While we might think of and speak in terms of the promise of science for society, in reality, policy decisions, along with various practices, leave some populations underrepresented in research, less trusting of research results and new technologies, or priced out of the market. This translates to inequitable access to benefits and breakthroughs in science and technology. We will consider today the role of improved public and stakeholder engagement in science and science policy to support research outcomes that benefit society as a whole. Today, we want to explore both how science research and developments lead to innovation, but also how it can result in inequities when this work is disconnected from public interests and concerns. I'm thinking of developments of medical interventions that are too expensive for the majority of Americans to afford, of research priorities that overlook conditions affecting mainly underserved communities, or technology that's developed using biased data that perpetuate and exacerbate biases and inequities. In addition, as many have noticed during the pandemic, there's an increasing divide between those conducting science and the public who might not be familiar with the scientific process and might be wary of the information being passed down. Some of these issues can be improved by increasing engagement between scientists and the public. And by engagement, I do not mean simply scientists giving talks and educating the public, but actual dialogues to help both groups understand each other, their priorities, and their interests. To discuss these and other issues, we have two excellent speakers today, Dr. Sheila Jasanoff and Dr. Mahmud Farooque. After their brief presentations, there will be an opportunity for our speakers to answer questions. We'd like to hear from you, our audience. Thank you for joining us. We ask that you please submit questions via the question box, and we'll do our best to include as many questions as we can. Our first speaker this morning is Dr. Sheila Jasanoff. Dr. Jasanoff is the Forsheimer Professor of Science and Technology Studies at the Harvard Kennedy School. Dr. Jasanoff's scholarly contributions in the role of science and technology in law, politics, and policy are unmatched. Specific areas of work include science and the courts, environmental regulation and risk management, comparative public policy, social studies of science and technology policy. Her many books and other publications have transformed the field and include The Fifth Branch, Science at the Bar, Designs on Nature, The Ethics of Invention, and Can Science Make Sense of Life? Welcome, Dr. Jasanoff.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, and above all, for the opportunity to talk to you about this extremely important topic confronting us today. So for whose benefit is science being done, and what can policy do to make sure that those benefits are realized in practice? And you've already alluded to a number of the lines of division in society that don't seem to be bridgeable by just generating more knowledge. So I want to step back and talk about the context in which the whole idea of science as a benefit for the public has arisen. And if somebody would share the screen and show my first slide, we can take it from there. So I am not seeing anything yet. Is the slide visible? Okay, there we go. Thank you so much. If we could go back to the title slide again, and let's move on to the next slide. Okay, I would like to, okay. All right, so it's important, I think, to begin by noting that there is not a scientific culture today in any country that has a science culture, which is ignorant of the fact that science is publicly supported and is there for the public benefit. So here are some selected quotations from major organizations that represent large bodies of scientists. So the International Council for Science, formerly called International Council of Scientific Unions, or ICSU, says as its mission, strengthening international science for the benefit of society. So note how many times the idea of society and the idea of benefit come up in these formulations. The AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the publisher of Science magazine, and with which I've been associated for a very long time, has a very crisp slogan: advancing science, serving society. I mean, there's good pragmatic American crispness for us in that idea. The Royal Society in Britain promotes the advancement of science, so you can see that as being like advancing science. And then for the benefit of humanity and the good of the planet, so that's even more broad-ranging than society, if you will. The French Académie des Sciences has a similar sort of thing, contributes to the progress of the sciences and their applications, studies the questions of society that are bound up with the development of the sciences. So an acknowledgement that what happens in science is related to society. And then one of excuse me, one of the more recent organizations to join the international community of scientific organizations, but already a very influential one in Germany, the Leopoldina, says in its mission statement that it's, among other things, it promotes the responsible application of scientific insight. So that's similar to the French contributes to the applications of the sciences, and like the Royal Society, for the benefit of humankind and the natural world. So these are big promises, but they reveal a kind of modesty, if you will, in the situation of organized science, that they see science as being a handmaiden to wider societal interests. So the who is benefiting, I mean, from the standpoint of the sciences and the scientists, very much they want the public and society and indeed humankind to benefit. So let's go on. So some of this has taken, understandably, the form of saying that, well, how do we benefit society? First of all, we have to make sure that the science itself is right. And so getting the science right has been a slogan inside of the Science for Public Benefit community. And how do you do that? Well, you speak truth to power. That too is a well-known formulation in the science policy world. And serving society then, from that point of view, is seen largely as a matter of getting the best knowledge into policy making. How do you do that? And it's well to remember that in this society, as well as in others, we've constructed a whole mass of organizations and procedures to make sure that the best possible science is getting into policy. We have scientific advisory committees, expert advisory committees. We have peer review of policy relevant science. That's what my what now 35-year-old book, The Fifth Branch, was all about. Public understanding of science and technology. We've done many, many surveys. The NSF has conducted these public understanding of science surveys. And since Jack Marburger's tenure as presidential science advisor under President George W. Bush, we've actually tried to step back and see that the science in policy itself is seen as a science, and that we try to study systematically what its implications and impacts are. But ironically, what do we confront at the end of the day? Persistent conflicts, particularly in America, over what sound science is. So let's go on. A different angle is to start not with getting the science right, but with getting the right science. And I think that's what today's session focuses on more. So that comes from the standpoint of my school, for instance, the public policy school, and the recognition. I mean, when science says it's for the public benefit, that's like possibly not a completely taken for granted thing for everybody who thinks about science. The idea that public policy is fundamentally a matter of serving society, everybody understands that. But before we serve society through policy, we have to decide what is the public good and what is in the public interest. And for that, we have to make prior decisions, early pipeline decisions, about the right problems that we want to address through science and technology, and then which science and technology do we choose and promote, whose responsibility is it to produce that science, and of course, there are paychecks at the end, so who pays and who benefits. Let's go on. So there are two different ways in which people, science policy people at a very high level, have tried to address this question. One relates to the idea that the best driver of science for the public benefit is human curiosity. And this is embodied in one of its premier forms in the Center for Nuclear Research, the European Center known as CERN in Geneva. And if you visit CERN, you meet up somewhere, this rather resonant quotation. Here you are at the heart of it all, where the detector's raison d'etre becomes apparent. Here's the reason why the member states of CERN are supporting this timeless project and why so much effort and money are being dedicated to it to advance human knowledge, to continue an endless quest to learn. And then at the very end, it says, no, for this essential quest is a contribution to keeping humankind on the path of curiosity and intelligence, thereby enhancing our pride as human beings. So this is a very high level, maybe even above the proverbial 35,000 feet, saying that we as humankind, as a species, would not thrive if we did not do science for our overall benefit. Let's go on. This is a very different kind of quotation, and I think fits quintessentially with the role of science policy in the United States. And this is the idea that science should be problem-driven, and we should be grateful to science because it's solving public problems. So there, if you visit the Hans Bethe House in Los Alamos, you find this quotation from a speech by President John F. Kennedy in 1962. So we want to express our thanks to you, the scientists of Los Alamos. It's not merely what was done during the days of the Second War, but what has been done since then, not only in developing weapons, and then he goes on to say that there are the peacetime uses also, but also in medicine and in space and all the other related fields, which can mean so much to mankind if we can maintain the peace and protect our freedom. So these are American ideas of the ideals as well of the mid-century, which are taken to be humankind's ideals, but they articulate themselves through particular policy applications. So, part of the balance that science policy has to strike is that there are these two different streams of justification for why we're doing the science in the first place. And, I personally am a believer in both of them going on and not just one or the other. So let's go on. So in America, we can point to a number of milestone projects. So it's not just empty words. The federal government has, at various points over the last more than half century, constructed major projects that are supposed to be science for the public good and for the public benefit. And I won't stop on each of these, but it's important to look at a couple of them and keep in mind what they did. So note that many times we have invested in public health. That is a taken for granted thing. Both sides of the of Congress agree on this. There's not much debate. Across the aisles, there's not much division. And then in 1980, we passed a statute that was about the public benefit. It said essentially that universities, which get a lot of public funding to do basic research, this is the curiosity-driven kind of research as well, that they have a positive duty to make sure that their discoveries get channeled into applicable science. So to make sure that intellectual property rights are claimed and to effectuate the translation from bench to bedside, as it's called in medicine. Let's go on. So we can see American biotech policy as, in a way, the child of this kind of science policy. And, some of the inequities that you mentioned before relate to medicine, but biotech is quintessentially implicated in medicine. So if we look at it a little bit closer, maybe we can see how some of the tensions between the public input and the public benefit, but not the public output and everybody being treated equally, how that comes about. So US biotech policy was crafted in important part in a place called Asilomar in California, which was a conference center. And I don't have time to talk about it in detail. But one thing to point out is that whoever was there was extremely narrowly chosen. This was not a public event. This was organized by scientists, Nobel laureates, and it involved largely molecular biologists. And so there was not much space for social concerns or the legislation that effectuates social concerns. And again, we can come back to specific examples, but a public controversy in this country has been around bovine growth hormone and its genetically engineered version, and should we use it? Turns out that no agency in the US quite has the authority to deal with that kind of animal rights argument, because the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, only deals with human impacts and effects. So let's go on. Biotech policy back in the 1970s, when people were mainly concerned with genetic engineering, has gone through several evolutions. And very important one was the mapping and sequencing of the human genome. These images display to you how public that input was and that whole project was. So at its unveiling, there's President Bill Clinton applauding the venture, and Prime Minister Tony Blair, his counterpart in the UK, beamed in on screen to claim joint credit for a transatlantic alliance, but this time around a peaceful use of technology. And Science Magazine's very evocative cover image, which is something like a cross between a movie poster showing incredibly beautiful people, but arranged in a formation that looks like the genetic spiral DNA. So, all of this speaks to these ideas of for humankind, a national investment, a source of pride. Let's go on. And President Clinton spoke about it not just in secular terms, but in religious terms, which came easily to him as somebody raised in the southern United States. But this is not just limited to North and South. The idea that by doing science, we're carrying out God's will is, in fact, something that is shared by a lot of people who think about science and technology. But Bill Clinton's own language, what are we doing when we crack the human genome and discover how to sequence it? It's the language in which God created life. We're learning at the, we stand in awe at the complexity, the beauty, the wonder of God's most divine and sacred gift, which is life. But then we segue in the next paragraph to the applications. So doctors increasingly will be able to cure diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, diabetes, and cancer. And in fact, it is now conceivable, he says, returning to a cosmological metaphor, that our children's children will know the term cancer only as a constellation of stars. And there he's referring to the fact that there is a crab constellation called Cancer, and he's imagining a utopian future in which cancer has disappeared. So Bill Clinton was nobody's fool, and he must have known that in 1970, the US government launched the war on cancer and we're still fighting it. So it takes a very long time for these promises to come into fruition, but our presidents keep on articulating these kinds of promises that are supposed to come with the public benefit. Let's go on. So how does this articulate in practice? Well, the US government has invested a great deal in Operation Warp Speed, and who knows if these numbers are exactly right, but these are the numbers I could lay my hands on. $6 billion in developing the vaccine is not nothing. But if we go to the next slide, we see, so this is from the Wall Street Journal, not exactly a rabid progressive journal, and it points out that insiders at the vaccine makers sold their own stock. So is this insider trading or isn't it insider trading? It gets into the fact that we are investing a huge amount of money for the public benefit, and yet things in our regulatory structures are set up so that a small handful of private individuals can benefit a very large amount. So let's go on. Another problem that I don't have time to look at, but I thought it might be useful to look at problems at different levels of scale. So what should we do about climate change? It's on everybody's mind, on everybody's lips. Science policy is grappling with it. But should we engineer the planet? Geoengineering is about bringing about planetary changes, planetary scale changes, by managing planetary systems, and in this case, solar radiation, which after all is what the world lives off of in a sense. But which countries have the capability to deploy the geoengineering? Well, not surprisingly, it turns out that the countries with the biggest military capabilities also have the biggest capabilities to turn on the tap of geoengineering if we choose to go that way. Are there public forums for debates of this planetary scale kind? Remember that both the Royal Society and the Leopoldina in Germany talk about benefiting humankind on a planetary scale. So one might ask the question back to them, where are the forums and how does one discuss even something like the ethics of geoengineering? Let's go on. So as a segue to Mahmud, I would like to say two more things. One is we need to ask different questions for science and technology for the public good if we take this public good as more of a problem than it looks to be on the surface. And we should ask new questions, not what should we do with the technologies at our command, but back to decision making. How should we decide what we should do? Not what are the right scientific answers, so getting the science right, but what are the right goals and who decides what the right goals are? Not who are the experts for the situation, but what knowledge is even relevant and who has it, and not what is the most efficient solution, but who gains and who loses, and are those gains and losses acceptable? And then let's go on. So public engagement has emerged, and I'm so glad that you broadened out the idea of public engagement, but it has emerged as a sort of please-all answer to these questions. But public engagement is often undertaken without a very clear definition of what its purpose is or how it will link to policy. Both input and output ends, in other words, need to be thought about. It assumes that engagement is often a matter of informing how people should reason rather than how they should live with the technology, which is a different proposition. There is a technical problem of asking who is the public and how do we represent them. And often there is too little engagement, it comes too soon, and it is not adapted to changes in technology and society. Now, there are sophisticated answers to these things, and I think Mahmud Farooque will be talking about some of these things. So with that, let me thank you. Next slide. And pass it on.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Jasanoff. Again, please remember to submit your questions via the question box, and we'll do our best to include as many questions as we can at the end after the second presentation. Dr. Mahmud Farooque is our second presenter today. He is the Associate Director for Arizona State University's Center for Science and Policy, Center for Science, Policy, and Outcomes, a network of scholars promoting the use of science and technology to improve equity, justice, freedom, and quality of life. His work centers around linking science policy to better societal outcomes. Of special interest for our discussion today, Dr. Farooque coordinates the Expert and Citizen Assessment of Science and Technology, or ECAST network, which engages experts and citizens on decision-making related to science and technology policy. Welcome, Dr. Farooque, and thank you so very much for being here today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and very intimidating to follow Dr. Jasanoff, but I'll try to do my best to share my practitioner's worldview. Could I have my slides, please? So as I was saying, I entered this space as a practitioner trying to answer two questions. How can we make science more useful for society? And how can we make our decision-making about science more democratic? Today, I'll focus on the second question by talking about a reflexive approach to engaging the public. Next slide, please. So when I started to put together my presentation, as I usually do at the very last minute, I had my laptop open to the Wall Street Journal. Now, it hasn't been a week since a private company successfully sent and brought back a civilian crew from altitude higher than the space shuttle had traveled. While the discussion about SpaceX moved on to having better toilets in spaceship, boy, do we have lots of problems on the ground. Look closer, and many of them have strong science and technology component. However, that is not the only thing in common. Look at the societal side of the issue, and you will see a cascading set of failures. Next slide, please. So one set of failure has to do with public value failure. That is actually propagated by market success from companies like Facebook or Zoom, or even well-endowed institutions like Harvard, Stanford, and MIT. If you read closely, the line below the ranking story says that the best college ranking says that the school with the most resources to deal with the fallout from COVID-19 dominated the ranking. So you can understand the equity implications of that. The other set of failure has to do with uncertainty. You know, we are not very good at managing uncertainty when we have high decision stakes, a class of problem grouped as post-normal science problem, where we have uncertain facts, values in dispute, stakes high, decision urgent, like our response to COVID-19 and climate change. And there is the failure to include the whole of society. We are talking about better toilets on spacecrafts, but what about just clean drinking water for some of our neglected urban areas? Next slide, please. So the problem is at such a scale that we need a serious intervention into the system. So I don't have much to offer in that space, but what we have to offer is a tool, one tool that can somehow help in one dimension of the problem. And this tool is what is grouped as Participatory Technology Assessment, or PTA. It's an engagement model that seeks to improve the outcomes of science and technology decision-making through dialogue with informed citizens. So PTA tries to involve the non-experts who are representative of the general population, but who, unlike political, academic, and industry stakeholders, are generally underrepresented in science and technology-related policymaking. It's a tool that can potentially help us better assess public values, manage uncertainties, and also maybe help fill some of the democratic gaps we have. So recent OMB report to the president and methods to assess equity points to participatory technology assessment as a meaningful stakeholder engagement tool, particularly with underserved communities. Next slide, please. So our particular approach to PTA starts with where the Office of Technology Assessment had left off. So instead of waiting for eternity for favorable political climate to appear, in 2010, we proposed a distributed institutional network, which is called ECAS, Expert and Citizen Assessment of Science and Technology, where we combined academic research with informal science education and nonpartisan policy analysis. Specifically, what we tried to do was to add public participation with expertise. We wanted to integrate diverse values and perspective, and we also wanted to be constantly learning and innovating. And we wanted to be, as Dr. Jasanoff mentioned, not public engagement for the sake of public engagement, but public engagement integrated in policy and decision making. So after a demonstration project on worldwide views on biodiversity, we did quite a number of projects dealing with asteroids, nuclear waste issues, solar geoengineering, and driverless cars, and currently working on a project on human gene editing, which I'll talk a little bit more about. Now, as Dr. Jasanoff mentioned, that we have to start asking different set of questions. And we have to ask it early and in different points as the science and technology are developing. So public engagement is not something that is only to be done when we are done with the science and doing commercialization and so forth. It is when we are actually thinking about whether we should or should we not do it. And if we should do it, then how? And there is a place for engaging the public in those spaces as well. And last, also, I want to point out that engagement is not like a one and be done kind of activity. We need to layer engagement so it starts from the community level, extends to stakeholder, and extends to the broader public to address our democratic values and aspirations. Next slide, please. Next one, please. I think I spoke about that already. So our particular model has basically 3 deliberative activities. The first set of deliberative activity is framing the problem. It is important not to just leave that task to the expert, as the Sheila conference did. And it is a process that needs to be opened up to involve the public as well. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. And then there's the idea of bringing in the stakeholder, and what all of that goes into this problem framing aspects. And then we move into the citizen deliberation. We go by 4 criteria. First of all, we want absolute diverse representation. We want to hear the unheard voices, so we want to highlight them. We want this to be deliberative and multidirectional learning. It's not to just filling a deficit model, but also to listen from what the public has to say, because they have important and knowledge to share. And we want clear, comparable, and usable outputs so that it can feed into a decision-making process. So then there's another deliberative activity at the end when we are talking with, again, experts, stakeholders, and decision makers about the many of the known and surprising results that comes out of citizen deliberation. Next slide, please. So I'm going to just talk briefly to give you a flavor of what this looks like so that we can have more time for our discussion about talking about a project we are currently doing on human genome editing. It's a National Institute of Health funded project, and it has basically 3 aims. The first aim is to find all the major driving forces and uncertainties and develop plausible scenarios for the future. The aim 2 is to engage diverse public to identify public values, beliefs, and concerns surrounding them. And lastly, it's this synthesizing the results to inform policy and decision making. Next slide, please. Now, when we break down, as Dr. Jasanoff said, it's really, to do this right, it's a very, very complex undertaking. So there are many steps involved, and I'm just showing you this diagram, just as a flow diagram, what it takes so to go from a problem framing to actual deliberation, and then having the results and synthesizing them into reports, brief, and presentation, and so forth. I'll focus on two to give you a little bit flavor of two activities. The first set of activity is what we call open frame focus group, which gets into our whole framing step of deliberation. Next slide, please. So open framing focus group is part of the framing engagement process. It is a deliberative public value mapping method that empowers lay people to set the agenda for emerging technologies. Because studies have shown that if public engagement is too tightly framed around a particular technology, public opinion potentially comes biased towards that technology and the pre-existing scientific commitments. Open framing exercise help lay people situate emerging technology in broader context of systems it will influence. So here we instead of talking about gene editing, we spent 2 sessions with participants, about 50 group of 15, talking about health and well-being. And then we introduced the health talk about gene editing. And as you can see, that having them multiple tools to express, for instance, even drawing what they think the healthcare system is, which is a musical chair for some people and a big bureaucracy that's hard to navigate, you come up with very different sets of concerns about affordability, about access, about system non-sustainability, about undervalued types of cures, and about human connection. So these are very different from concerns from what expert would like us to think about when we think about gene editing. It usually goes about somatic versus germline, enhancement versus therapy, and so forth. So it's not to ignore that, but to remind ourselves that there are also other concerns that can help us frame the problem of introducing human gene editing in our healthcare system. So next slide, please. So fast forward from the framing exercise, after all the content and questions and all of the detailed facilitation has been prepared, we move on to hosting public forums. And we have, in this project, we are organizing 3 public forums in Boston, Phoenix, and Waco, about 60 people representing the diversity, and who will be going through a structured dialogue where they will get information material beforehand, they'll watch videos, they'll have facilitated discussion, and they will then share their views and values. Next slide, please. So this is just a picture of the forum just concluded during COVID time, first hour in a year and a half, one in Boston Museum of Science last weekend, and the other one in Phoenix, Arizona. So I want to end, I know my time is up, leaving you with just a perspective, next slide please, from one of the participants at the end of the forum. And I'll read it, you read his word a lot. I chose to come to this forum because I had no clue what it was about. I heard human genetics, but I didn't understood the concept. Being able to participate in this forum that I thought I knew little about, I realized that I was more uniquely qualified to talk about that I really thought I was. So with that, I started with the Wall Street Journal page with a lot of anxieties, but I end with hope, thinking that at least in this one instance, one person thinks that he has a voice to put in this big scientific enterprise. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Farooq. So we will bring Dr. Jasanoff back to join us, and we'll begin with our questions and discussion. And many thanks for the questions and comments that have already come in, and we'll continue to monitor that. So once Dr. Jasanoff is back with you, we'll begin.
Video and audio are on for me.
Great. Well, thank you so much to both of you for really engaging and interesting, important discussions. We'll begin, both of you mentioned the importance of public engagement, or at least as a part of advancing science and the public good. And I'm wondering if you can discuss a little bit more about why this is important in our democracy, why you hold that this is really an essential element of this, and whether you also might, related to that, comment on the expansion of who conducts science. So we received several comments and questions related not just to public engagement, but to who should conduct science, who does science, and where is scientific research conducted. And so I'm wondering if you might comment on the importance of public engagement in our democracy, but also on the role of expanding or diversifying the pool of science and scientists in advancing the public good.
Well, they're big questions. To the first part about why have public engagement at all, I'm sure Dr. Farooque would agree that the reasons on the one side of what do we think a democracy is all about, and on the other, there are also pragmatic, almost commercial reasons. So on the philosophical side, we think that in a democracy, it's the public that defines what the public good is. And so the engagement is needed in order to define the goals. You will learn this, obviously, it's an ABC of public policy, that the demand for the policy has to originate in the people, and then how to do it best, that can be the role of experts or whatever. But there's also a pragmatic reason. I mean, science delivers commodities at the end of the day these days. It's coupled to technology, and if the commodities are not what the people want, they will reject them. I mean, one of the issues that have followed over a long period of time is that in parts of the developing world, some of the pollution comes from domestic cook stoves, which use biological fuels, and they produce a lot of emissions, and in the aggregate, that's bad for climate and weather. Now, this is a technological area that you would think would be easy to resolve, and in fact, people have been trying to make new cook stove designs over 40 to 50 years, but nevertheless, the problem doesn't get solved, in part because the people for whom these cook stoves are being developed don't want them. And some of this has to do with indigenous cuisines of different sorts. So I come from India, and in North India, chapatis, this kind of fat bread that's cooked on it's sort of like tortillas. I mean, it would have to be cooked over very high heat. And these cook stoves substitutes don't render the kind of easily controllable high heat that people need to cook a staple food. So, it's taken decades for even that problem to be recognized. So, what would public engagement have done for us? I'll leave that as a thought experiment. As to the who should do the science, it can't be, as one of the comments suggested, only the university people. I live my life in universities and would stand up for their rights and their right to existence and my own freedom of inquiry any day. But at the same time, I recognize that scientists have their own selfish interests as well, and they want to do the things that they want to do and not what the public tells them to do. And besides, just as a matter of American science policy, we have made a collective decision that certain areas of knowledge generation we're going to give to other institutions. So if it's about the national security, we have a network of national labs, and they do a lot of the work. And that's a decision we've already made with infrastructure and sunk costs. So it's not simply a turn on the spigot and let the science come from this or that place. There are these historical investments and historical regulatory postures that have said something about who should be doing the science.
Thank you. Dr. Farooque, would you like to comment on that question?
Yeah, I mean, it's covered a lot of ground. I would just add to it, the nature of the emerging technologies that we have, is with where there's a high degree of uncertainty, and where the decision stakes are high. The scientific peer review process or the expert assessment are sometimes not enough for us to help what is the right decision. COVID was a good example. From vaccine to vaccinated, it's a different problem. So in those kind of instances, we need broader societal engagement. And public engagement, if it's done systematically to create the same kind of input as we are giving to expert assessment, we can make sort of better decisions. So that's why I would say it's important to engage the public in those kind of contexts. And in terms of, who can do science, we have an explosion and very welcome one on citizen science and maker movement that is, allowing non-credential scientists to participate in the scientific process. So, and they're making very, very valuable contributions. So I would, just point to that it doesn't need to be just the academically trained scientists, but the science today is actually accessible to a lot of people who are interested in either from a concern point of view or from just curiosity point of view.
Thank you so much. So kind of picking up on that importance of expanding the ability of people to truly understand and engage in science. We received a number of questions about sort of practical steps. In what ways can we ensure, for example, that public engagement is mandated or somehow required? What can be done to move in this direction more reliably and regularly? And kind of related to that, I suppose, someone asked a question about, how do you get the scientists of the world, right? How do you get the David Baltimores, for example, of the world to change their policies based on something like ECAST results, right? Based on the engagement of the contributions of public engagement in science. So I wonder if you could speak to some of those practical steps.
Well, there's a joke in the science policy world that a scientific revolution is only completed when all the holders of the old paradigm have died out. And, a little bit of that goes in decision making and ideology circles as well. I mean, David Baltimore is an extraordinarily distinguished scientist and public servant, but public engagement as an idea, democratization of science as an idea, these have moved on since the days of Asilomar, which are now almost a half century behind us. And I think that part of the answer to the second piece of the question is that today's young scientists come at these questions with a far different point of view than ones when I was a young scientist myself. So one of the things that we have constructed through the Science, Technology, and Society program at Harvard is a minor field in science, technology, and society. And a lot of our these are not vast numbers, but significant numbers of our hard science PhD students are doing that as something. And what I see as a hopeful sign is that their lab chiefs are allowing them to do it. So, there's a kind of ferment in the culture itself in which young scientists are recognizing both that it is their duty in a way to be talking to to be trying to ascertain what the public good is and to be speaking to it. And they also recognize that this is not just something, that your being a good scientist doesn't entitle you to be a good communicator, that you actually need a separate kind of disciplined training for this. So I put a lot of my hope and faith in the fact that the younger generation are, actually coming along and recognizing the need for something different. So let me pass it on to Dr. Farooque for answering the other part of the question.
Yeah, it is a hard problem. And I think from my practical experience, I think we have done a lot in terms of public understanding of science, but we haven't done enough in the science understanding of the public. Meaning like the scientists, still have, that is actually the biggest challenge for us. So what engagement becomes, it becomes a very high touch activity. Not only you have to get the public educated and informed, but you also have to ready the scientists to accept the input. The way it happened, the best way is to actually put them at the table as an observer. And I've seen that happen in a lot of our deliberations when we will have a scientist keynote speaker who will come in and give a speech and then say, okay, I want to sit at the table. And then they say, can I go to another table? and another table. And after that, we have seen some of them become great advocate of this dialogue because they get to see that you don't need a lot of university level education to have a discussion, which is essentially about public values. So I think that's one way to socialize, is to get scientists more opportunity to actually sit and listen and observe. And then I think that's the way we can change some minds.
Thank you. And I think both of you, Dr. Jasanoff mentioned students and Dr. Farooq just mentioned giving scientists more opportunities to actively do this. So this is a great time for a question from Mary Woolley of Research America, who commented, several of us are working to change the culture of science to embrace public engagement. One model is to require that graduate students in science take a course in the public context of science, so as to understand the value of public engagement and become confident in such engagement. I would love to know what our speakers think of such an approach. So I wonder if you might add to that, to your previous comments.
Well, I'd be happy to add to that, because this is something that I've been working on myself as an educator for a very long time. There is a big risk involved here, which is that the nanny knows best, mommy knows best, and science knows best. So who is actually going to run these courses? And there is, partly for personnel reasons, and universities being robust institutions that achieve robustness through stinginess, a deep unwillingness to invest in things that don't already exist and so forth. So why bother hiring people who will do this for you when in fact you think that it's perfectly fine for the person teaching the general science class or the PhD pro seminar or the introductory course for graduate students or whatever to throw in, one session. And I've been asked to do this innumerable times. We are teaching our graduate students a course in research methodology. Would you come and give the lecture on public engagement, on democracy, on law, on ethics, what have you? And it's one lecture, and you step into somebody else's course, and the attendance is probably lower that day than it is normally. And it's like teaching the civilization of your own society in a packaged up 50-minute installment, and then satisfying the tick box requirement that you exposed your students to thus and such. And related to that, one point I wanted to make about the earlier question, the what can we do to get more public engagement built in? In the history of the United States of America, the late 1960s and 1970s were a time when this was accepted as an important proposition and was built into all our environmental and health and safety laws. So in 1969, we enacted an exceedingly forward-looking precautionary sustainability law called the National Environmental Policy Act. And the nub of that statute was, if any federal agency was doing anything to significantly affect the quality of the human environment, it was incumbent on that agency to consult the public and to consider alternatives. So NEPA, the first statute of its kind, was revolutionary in that respect as a requirement from Congress to all of the executive branch. And then what happened? I mean, we don't have time to talk about it in detail, but it shows the difference between the articulation of a norm and the ways in which we end up implementing it. And if we want to make, 1770s style revolution in the country, to some extent, it's a question of reclaiming rights that we already have. And it's for the people to think about how to do this, and not only for experts to think about how to do this. But as somebody who is very much on the Mary Woolley side of the ledger, working from inside universities, I will tell you that having a requirement on the books, forget it. That's only the first step. I mean, having the people who will understand the norm of the requirement and the trained people who are going to deliver this. I mean, it is not just a casual thing anymore. We know a lot in this area. And you can't just have a scientist who's thought 3 minutes about the difference between enhancement and therapy, come along and say, oh, therapy is great and enhancement isn't. I mean, that's not an adequate framing of the problem anymore.
Dr. Farooq, did you want to add anything?
No, I'll just agree with everything Sheila said, and it cannot be an afterthought. Just like the National Academy report on gene drive says, that public engagement needs to be right there as we are doing the science. So I think that realization has come, but it's for academia and other places to now, rise up and meet that expectation that's being set.
Thank you. So as we near the end of our time, I'm going to ask you both if you'd consider reflecting on the sort of current state of the world as we find ourselves 18 months into the COVID-19 pandemic. I wonder whether you might share with us any reflections you have on how greater attention to substantive, really meaningful public engagement with science might have changed the course of the pandemic in the United States.
So my colleague Stephen Hillgartner at Cornell and I have been leading a 16-country comparative study of policy responses to COVID since about April of last year. And one of the early findings was that country responses divided up into 3 broad types, and these types have attracted a lot of attention. We called one of them control, one of them consensus, and one of them chaos. China was the archetype of control, military style control, and getting the virus under control pretty quickly after initially allowing it to escape. Germany was a prototype, not the only one, of the consensus approach, where even though that early control was not possible, there was a great deal of societal agreement that this is a crisis and we have to pull it together. And although Germany is a federal state, the different Länder, their different states, agreed to put their self-interest on the back burner and come together as a nation. And the US, which had been rated the most prepared on the Global Health Security Index, proved to be an archetype of the chaos country because there was no political will and no political authority, and people in the highest places didn't pull the country together. And the interesting thing is that even though we had pretty much a U-turn in the 2020 election and the policy thereafter, it's not obvious that that initial setting to chaos has been overcome. So, today's vaccine hesitancy to some extent is a relic of having fed a set of views that the country was somehow ripe for. So I think that one of the things that, in my own reflecting on this is, how do we cure the ailments of political systems that are mature and well developed, but they're like creakiness of old age? I mean, that is, we really need to rethink some of the fundamental propositions of our own democracy. I mean, this is why I'm thrilled that there is a Baker Institute that is operating together with other institutions to be thinking about these issues in a deep-seated way. This is everybody's business now, and I'm just one in 350 millionth of the U.S. population thinking about this, and I think we have to really reflect on, I sometimes call this the moment of a second enlightenment. I mean, what kinds of societies are we going to become?
Thank you. Dr. Farooq, would you like to add anything?
I think there is an opportunity at the beginning of any problem about naming and framing the problem. And once the problem is framed in a certain way, it's hard to change course. So I think there was an opportunity, just like Dr. Jasanoff said at the very beginning. And if we could have done the vaccine development in warp speed, we could have done the social engagement that we needed also in warp speed. It's just something to keep in mind for next time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This has been a fantastic conversation. And unfortunately, we are out of time this afternoon, but thank you so very much to Drs. Jasanoff and Farooq for taking the time to be with us today. And I'd also like to thank our audience for joining us, for your questions, for your comments, and for your attention. Before closing this event, I want to invite everyone to attend the many events being hosted by the Baker Institute. You can find more information on those events at the Baker Institute website. The next event is October 20th at noon with Mr. Antonio Neri, the President and CEO of Hewlett-Packard Enterprises. In addition, you can also watch past events through the Baker Institute YouTube account, including discussions on diversity in STEM, government industry collaborations, and the future of research in the United States. So until next time, I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy, and thank you so very much for joining us today.